Well, we know that the church at Corinth, many of which were immature as believers. I say many because there were no doubt some who were mature, who had been called to serve as elders, and many other Christians who were growing up. But a large majority perhaps of the church remained in an immature spiritual state. And so Paul writes to them concerning the various issues that resulted from their spiritual immaturity. And as a result, what God has given to us in this book to the Corinthians is a great manual full of pastoral wisdom. And of course, that is of such help to us in the church today. But the okay. So the Apostle Paul had to sort out the many squabbles that there were within the church at that particular time. And it's because he had to write in such a way that he wrote, not just as a pastor, but he wrote in a similar way that a parent would address their own children. And I do believe that this is one of the reasons why any man raised up to be an elder, and whether he be a teaching elder or just a ruling elder, does need to rule his own household well. He does need to be a man of experience. We had recently in our own house an issue about both boys wanting the same toy. And one of the things that was being said to the boys, full of good wisdom, is, well, the first person can have the toy for 5 minutes, and the person who goes second can have it for 6 minutes. So you can have a whole extra minute of enjoying the toy. And of course, that seemed to sort out the problem. And one went and played it for 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes later, the other had it for the whole 6. Again, it's just a way of parenting, of getting children to learn, to share, and to correct them often. And parenting is, on the largest part, one of encouragement. We encourage good behaviour, but sometimes we have to discipline children as well. And we have to take them to one side, and the biblical way of disciplining children is to smack children physically, and that they should know that from that little bit of temporary pain, the thing that they were doing was wrong. And so again, parenting is a prequel, if I could say that, to pastoral work. And of course we see this very much picked up on in the call of any man to be a pastor, because we're told that if anyone wants to be a bishop or an overseer, a pastor of the church, we might say, he must be one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? And so again, we see here that the parental advice and correction and encouragement and other such things are all part of the Christian ministry as well. And it really does make me think about the whole idea that the Roman Catholics have, that any man who goes into the ministry should not be married. Well, it seems completely contrary to the Word of God. The idea is that he is given over entirely to Christ, and he hasn't got to worry about his wife and his children, and he can just give himself to the ministry. But it's not what the Bible says. It says that he should be a man with one wife and his children subject to him. So that's not to say that if he is single, he can't go into the ministry, but there are great advantages for a man who's married and knows about bringing up children and looking after his own household and such. So there is, to some extent, within the church, the requirement that there be elders who are mature in the faith, not necessarily mature in years. Paul said to Timothy, do not despise a man because of his youth, or let no man despise you because of your youth. So it's not you have to wait until you're in your 40s or something like that before you reach some level of maturity. No, but it's spiritual maturity. A person must be spiritually mature, and he should have some experience of life, the world of work, and the stresses and strains that many to whom he will minister to, that he knows what that world of work is, and family life as well. So I say this because this was lacking in the church, and Paul in this chapter has to, as it were, step in and quite alarmed that certain situations were developing in the life of the church. And the situation was, of course, that as we see here in the first 6 verses, that some Christians were taking other Christians to a secular court. They had a problem with them, and they were suing them. They were taking them to court. And this is very alarming to the Apostle Paul, that such a thing should take place, and that they couldn't sort things out within the church itself, which they should have done. So there's a number of things that we can consider in this passage, and we've read those 6 verses. And the first point of application is this, about the relationship that the church should have toward elders. Now it does say in verse 5, for example, it says, I say to you, say this to your shame, is it so that there is not a wise man among you, not even one who is able to judge between his brethren? Well, that is largely for the maturer believer. A wise man means a mature Christian who is able to judge. You know, he's got some experience. He knows how to deal with things. And so the relationship to elders, is there not a wise man among you? And so we do start with the eldership in the church. Of course, not every mature believer is an elder. We don't hold to that. But we must start with the eldership. And of course, not all elders are teaching elders. Some are ruling elders. Now, I know that's a point of dispute, and I'm not here to, argue one point or the other. But all elders are ruling elders. They are to rule within the church. They are to keep the church in order. And if there is disorder taking place, they're the ones that would come and sort it out. So they are to rule within the church. But they're to rule not with some dictatorial authority, but with grace and gentleness. And that's what an elder is to do. And with much grace, with much gentleness, with much understanding, listening to the needs of the congregation, being prayerful, biblical in wisdom in his thinking, and he acts with grace and gentleness. He's very approachable, and they are to rule in that way. There is, of course, in the church today, in some churches, a fear in the church of heavy shepherding. And, that can happen in some churches. And I heard of just such a case quite recently about a pastor who had a drawer full of ties in case somebody should come into his church, a man, and not have a tie on. And he would say, here, my brother, go and sort yourself out. Well, again, I think that is a little bit over authority. and many other such things. So you do hear some of that. And of course, there is a fear in some pastors as a result that, we're not to really confront or get involved in people's lives, because we might be, God forbid, accused of being a heavy shepherd. And as a result, the person, the pastor, is hardly able to say anything to anyone. Well, that shouldn't be the case. There is a rule. Elders must rule, and they must do so with a spirit of great grace. We're told this when it comes to knowing how to reconcile. So you've got a congregation, and there are two brethren, as we see in this passage, that are not getting on one another. There's been a dispute. And what they haven't done, they haven't gone to see the elder about it. They've just tried to, we're going to take it to court. We're going to take it outside of the church. We're going to put down, a requirement for the person to appear and get witnesses, and everything will be done by a secular court. So, the elders in this church weren't doing their job. They weren't seeking to reconcile the two brothers. And that's one of the things that elders must do. They are there to maintain order and to maintain peace. Just like two children squabbling. You've got to deal with them, both. And sometimes you might have to deal with them quite firmly. But there's a lovely passage in Galatians which talks about maybe someone, one of the brothers here has perhaps sinned against the other. It says, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such as a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted." So here is one of the roles of the elder, as a spiritually minded man, to come alongside the brother and seek to reason with him, and to do it in a very spirit of gentleness, and try to remonstrate and pray with him and to solve the problem. And so, of course, that's true of an individual who might be sinning in a particular way, or it might be in that more tricky situation, more difficult situation, when you've got two members who are kind of not getting on very well and are not talking to one another. And, we've had at times those who have even refused to look someone in the eye or shake their hand. Well, these are very shameful things for any Christian to act in such a way. Of course, one of the things we know in the way that the church should operate is that we must keep short accounts with one another. And that means that if we mustn't, allow a spirit of discontent to arise between us. And if someone's done something wrong against us, we go and maybe in private just speak to one another, sort it out, as mature people. We're not to be like the toddlers. This is the problem with Corinth. They had too many spiritual toddlers. We need to grow up to maturity. And then, of course, we can go and see a person and say, look, I wasn't quite happy about the way you did this or said this or acted in this way. And we're to sort it out, just between the two of you. In fact, the biblical method, it's been very laid out for us clearly in Matthew chapter 18. Let me just read to you some of these words, because this is all to do with disputes between two believers, how we should be doing things. There is, in fact, a very clear biblical model. It says, "Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone." So there's the first part, isn't it? And if he hears you, you have gained your brother. So that's something we should be doing. The person might not even realize that they've caused the offense. Approach them with gentleness. Sit down with them. Reassure them from the beginning of your great love for them. And then perhaps broach the matter and resolve it between the two of you in private. Just the two of you. That's how things should operate in the church. And if that was done, the the church would continue. It wouldn't cause any division opening up. Of course, if it's between the two of you and it's in private, it's very important that you do not complain to others about the person. Because as soon as you do that, you've involved a third person. And, sometimes what you can find in a church, that you have a problem against another believer and you get someone, you share with them. In fact, it's gossip in some ways. It's saying what you shouldn't. It should be just between the two of you. Don't involve someone else. And sometimes that's when the church, really does go wrong. So the Bible is very clear here. Tell him his fault between you and him alone. A private meeting. You sort it out in a matter of moments, as it were. Or you sit down, you talk it through, and you come to a resolution. But it goes on in verse 16 to the second stage. And it says, but if he will not hear you, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And so this is the point where he won't listen to you and you need a witness. Now, who better in the local church than to take one, or if you've got more elders, at least one of the elders with you. And so you've tried to sort it out between you and he's refused to listen to you, he's refused to see that he's done anything wrong. You take an elder with you, you talk to him again in the presence of the elder, he's a witness. And of course it's good to have an elder there, because the third stage is if he doesn't hear the mature leader of the church, then of course it is to be brought in the next stage, which we read of. It says, if he refuses to hear them, verse 17, tell it to the church. And if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be like to you a heathen or a tax collector, meaning that he is put out of fellowship within the church. So there is that order, isn't there? There's a number of safeguards there. You're going through one barrier, you're going through another barrier. You're refusing to hear the person, you're refusing to hear perhaps another person who's going to remonstrate with you, an elder. Of course, then, after a period of time, it might have to come to the church and result in discipline. So that's how things are. So Matthew 18 is about personal offences. Some people see Matthew 18 as the only way that we should... The only way that we should exercise church discipline. And if it doesn't follow the line of Matthew 18, well, we've done something terribly sinful and wrong. Well, that's not the case. Matthew 18 is about personal offences between two people, or one person who's refusing to be reconciled to his brother. So what the Corinthians were doing here, that was laid down by the Lord Jesus in Matthew 18. So it was well established in the church, I am sure. And what the Corinthians were doing was short-circuiting God's way of doing things. They weren't seeking to deal with the brother or involve an elder or bring it to the church. They were going straight out of the church into the court of law. So there's the question, there's the thing, isn't it? But the whole point about these verses that you see in Matthew 18, everything is kept within the church. If you involve an elder at that second stage, because the first part is just private, then the elder isn't going around telling everyone in the church or telling anyone outside the church. And when it's brought to the church meeting, all of that is very confidential. And, they're not going to be telling people outside of the church what went on in the church meeting. We know that that's wrong to do. So again, everything is kept within the confines of the church. But here, they're going outside the church. And of course, we would say as well, in all of that we've spoken of in Matthew 18, not one part of it is heavy shepherding. You say, well, why are you involving one of the elders in this dispute between the two of us? That's considered by some as heavy shepherding. It's not. It's shepherding. Okay? There is a difference, and we must make that difference. Of course, as a result, within the church, we have an obligation, all of us, to, and I think this is really good from Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, if it is possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. And so the context there is, again, the local church. It has wider application, I believe, as well, but the context is the local church. And so we're to live peaceably. The church is to be a place of peace where we all get on well with one another. So it's one of those things, isn't it, that a situation is not a problem till it becomes a problem. And this is really what this is talking about. You know, when something does become a problem, and there will be that in the church, just like there will be in the family. And, you know, brothers might fall out with one another on a short-term basis, and hopefully will be reconciled and the family can go on. But you see, we've got these stages. Private, between the two of you, involving one or more of the elders, and then the church. And so you resolve all the wrongs within the church. Within the church. In a spirit of love and understanding and forgiveness. So, you know, this isn't a kind of court of law where one person's shouting at another and you said this, and the person's back. No, we've got to do things in a way, in a spirit of love and forgiveness. And that's what we sign up for in the life of the church. So I've given a lot of background, which is really an interpretation of what was going on in Corinth. But look at verse 1 now. And it says, dare any of you, having a matter against one another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints. Do you see the whole situation now? And Paul is astounded that these people should do such a thing, that this should actually take place in the church. So again, we come to the one of the second parts that can be drawn out from this passage, and I think it's this, that there is to be. Now we know that God has given two great, as it were, courts. There is the church and state, but the church and the state are to be separate from one another. Both, so the court of law, the law courts that you would find, you know, down the road, as it were, which would involve a judge and a jury perhaps. The court of law is part of the state. Okay? We're happy that we have law courts that stand for justice, and we have laws that are civil laws for everyone to obey. That's of God. But it's also the church, which is an organisation, a family, and there is a court within the church as well. Now, Christians, a Christian is a member of both the church and a member of the state. But the bond that we have to the church is stronger than that which we have toward the state. In fact, we're not going to go into it tonight, but if you read on, it says that it's better for us to actually be cheated by one another than to go to court. You know, just, okay, suffer the wrong and forgive the brother from the heart. Don't go to court over it. So we have a strong bond within the church, and this bond is described in many ways. When we're thinking of the the life of the church. I was thinking of the life of the church at Corinth and the life of the church here. Any local church, and we are thinking very strictly of in that context, it's described as being a family. It's a family. So a family is a unit, isn't it? And what takes place in the family should stay within the family. Sometimes you can hear shouting, the neighbours hear something or other, but all of the little petty arguments, you don't bring that out into the open. You keep it within the family. And so a church is described as being part of the family. But there's even a greater description of the church. You think that's a wonderful thing, a spiritual family that you belong to. But there's something even closer still, and that is that we are members of one body. We are members of one body. And that is, the body of Christ, the local church. Yesterday, we were hearing about the definition of the church. Reuben and I went up to the London Seminary, and it was about the planting of a church in a particular area. So the biggest question, the number one question, is to really ask, what is a church? What are you seeking to establish, you see? So you need to understand what a church is. And we had a definition which could come down under three words beginning with the letter B. First of all, that a person is a believer. Okay, so we hold that. If a person isn't born again, they can't be a member of the church. Okay? So first of all, they're a believer. God has worked in their hearts. So it's not that they're a nice person or a very wealthy person or a very practical person that's warm to us. No, it must be a believer. Secondly, they must be baptized as a believer. And when we think of baptism in that sense, that a person then comes into membership of that church. But the third one, which is most important, is that we belong to one another. We belong to one another. And this is really something that's so important for us to grasp about the nature and functioning of the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 21, we read this, and I think this is a very penetrating verse. It says, "The eye cannot say to the hand, 'I have no need of you,' nor again the head to the feet, 'I have no need of you.'" You're part of the same body. Some are hands, some are eyes, some are feet. We all have different roles within the church, different gifts that the Holy Spirit has given for the church to function. But you see, like the hand or the eye, it belongs to the body. It belongs. Okay, that's my hand. Those are my fingers. This is my eye. It belongs to me as a body. So you see the close connection that there is between the members. It's not that you're like a member of a club and there are a set of rules and you agree to abide by the rules and you pay your subscription, now you're a member of the club. Okay? And if you want to cease to be a member of the club, you say, "I no longer want to be a member of the club, thank you very much. I'm not going to renew my subscription, take me off your roll, I'm going somewhere else." That is very much the opposite of what a church is like. We belong spiritually to one another. The Lord adds a person to that church, and they belong to one another. So if a brother falls out with another brother, can you see how completely wrong it must be for the person to say, "I would like to tender a letter of resignation. I'm writing you to let you know that I no longer consider myself a member of this church and I'm leaving. I'm going somewhere else." Can you think of such a thing? This is saying, the eye saying to the hand, I have no need of thee. I don't need you. Right? I'm not part of you. Well, you belong. And that's important. So nobody, let me say this, we will never accept a letter of resignation because you are completely undoing the whole thing about the church. It's a worldly concept. And you're being worldly. It's like the club. I resign from the club. It might be dressed up in nice words and be very dignified. But there is a direct denial of what the local church is. Because they're saying, I don't need you. And you don't need me. And we can just go our separate ways. So, although it may be dignified, it is a denial. It is saying to Jesus Christ, I care nothing for your body. I'm going my own way. Now, let me say this. This belonging is not something that is hypothetical. This is a very real spiritual bond. It's God. We make mention of this. It's God who adds someone to the church. Right? By the Holy Spirit. It's an actual grafting in of that individual to the body of the church. And it's only God who can remove that person from the church. And a person might feel that there's a calling to another place. And so he comes. And the right way to do things is to come and say, look, I feel that I'm called to another place. It might be my work is taking me to another place, or I'm moving for something else to this place. I feel that this is where the Lord's calling me to serve Christ in another place. Of course, then you have a conversation. You say, okay, let's talk about it. Let's examine that calling. Let us send you with our blessing. Let's make sure that everything is, there's no offence caused and there's much prayer and the sending out of that person. That's right. So you can leave a body because the Lord is clearly calling you to another place. What you can't do is write a letter and saying, I resign. Because that is tearing yourself away. It's cutting yourself away from the church. You are in a covenant relationship with one another. Put it this way. A marriage. You get married to somebody. It's a very important thing. You don't enter into it lightly. You just don't think, this would be a good thing for us to do. Let's get married. Don't think too much about it. This is a lifetime commitment, isn't it? Something you've got to think very carefully about. And when you make your vows before God, in the sight of God and a congregation of people, you say, for better and for worse, in richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, and other such things. In other words, you're saying, look, there's going to be times in the marriage where you're going to have difficulties between you. Right? You're going to fall out. You're going to argue. And, one of you, it's usually the husband in my case, will go off and sulk for a while. Okay? And then you come back and you reconcile, you talk it through. Now, that's marriage, isn't it? And anyone who says, I've never had a cross word with my wife, or I've never had a cross word with my husband, is not really telling the truth, in all honesty. Right? Now, the thing is, you have difficulties in a marriage. What do? You meet, you talk, you resolve it. You don't just want to say, right, that's it, I'm up and leaving. I seem to have a difficulty with you, and therefore I'm leaving. I'm leaving the house. And that's what happens. Is that not the most worldly thing you can think of? Isn't that what happens in Folkestone every day? Where, in fact, some people don't even get married because divorce is very messy. But there's the person, he walks out. The person walks out. In fact, what the world wants today, and it's being pushed through Parliament at this moment, they want a no-fault divorce. No fault. Okay, so I'm not going to lay any accusations against you. You're not laying accusations. We're just not getting on. So we'll come to a judge and he can say, okay, you no longer want to be married. Okay, you sign this bit, you sign this bit, and you go your separate ways. That's what the world wants, a no-fault divorce. The only way that anyone should be divorced is if one of the person has committed adultery. Or there might be very full of domestic abuse. There are other such things that the Bible does talk about. But you've got to stick with it. You've got to sort it out. You don't leave. You resolve it. Perhaps you might sit down with a marriage counsellor and they sit down and talk things through, help you put things together, see where it's going wrong. But today it's you draw up papers, you sign it, and you're out. So of course the world is scoffing today at God, the ordination that God has put for marriage. It's a covenant relationship. They are shaking their fist at the whole idea of a covenant relationship. I was given this illustration, Reuben and I, at the seminary the other day, and I thought I'd be the first to get this illustration into a sermon. And some people treat the church like a bus. A church is like a bus. You jump on, you're waiting at the bus stop, you jump on, pay your fare, you sit down, and everything's going well. You've got to sit down with other people. Hopefully they're not too annoying as you're making your way. And as long as it's going in the direction that you want it to go, you're quite happy. But if you don't like what's going on, you don't like the way that the bus driver is driving, or maybe some of the people are being a bit noisy, well, what do? You just ring the bell, you jump off, and you get the next bus, or you might be going in a different direction. And so it's a case of you jump on, you jump off. You jump into church membership, you don't like that church, after a while you fall out with someone, well, you jump off and go somewhere else. That's how people treat the church. But that is not what the church is like. That is such a worldly picture of the church. There was a great emphasis that if you're planting a church, that there is a meaningful membership. And my ears pricked up at that. A meaningful membership. It is a covenant relationship that you have with each other. And our family covenant, I meant to have brought one down with me tonight, but it starts like this. As regards our conduct towards each other, we esteem it our duty and privilege to walk with each other with all humility and love, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves and so on. But we're to sympathise with one another, we're to encourage one another, we're to admonish one another. But there it is, we walk with each other with all humility and brotherly love. It's our duty and our privilege. It's a covenant relationship. If we keep to the covenant relationship, the family covenant, then the church would go well. It's the means whereby you've got a difficulty where you sit down, you talk it through, like a marriage. You don't just write, "Dear John, I'm off." That's the world. I think I've made the point clear. We belong to one another. So here is a case in Corinth that people weren't getting on, and they were going their separate ways. They're taking each other to court and getting unbelievers to judge about the case. So there's much to say, really, in this passage, I believe, about the importance of the local church and how it should function, particularly in resolving difficulties. It's interesting in verse 2, it says, do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, so it means that the church members are the saints, so let's just get that clear, are you unworthy to judge in the smallest matters? Now the interesting thought here, here's the thought. We are going to judge the world, right? And I can only imagine how some Bible commentators or preachers will just pick up on that and run with it. But we must consider the context. And what Paul is using here, he's using an illustration from the greater to the lesser. He's saying, look, if you are going to be judging angels, can you not judge menial matters of life and everyday life in the life of the church between you? That's the argument, isn't it? It goes on in verse 3 to say that. He says, do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more then the things that pertain to this life? And again, if you then have judgments concerning things pertaining to this life, do you appoint those who are least esteemed by the church to judge? In other words, other people. So the church is equipped to judge with matters. More often than not, the issue is spiritual. The issue is spiritual. Okay? Most of the time. Number one, probably pride. Pride is the biggest issue. And this is why, if we come to a point, we must walk with each other with all humility and brotherly love. Pride is most often the issue. Selfishness is another big issue, particularly in a marriage. Selfishness is one of the biggest problems, and just unbiblical practice. So these are the things that often happen in the church. So these underlying principles of pride and selfishness and self-will and other such things are not understood by the world. They don't understand pride. They don't understand unbelief. They don't understand biblical principles. So why are you getting worldly people to judge? The solution often is very simple. One person says sorry, and the other person forgives them. And they shake hands, and everything's put right. Okay? And if you can't say sorry to a fellow believer, then there's something very seriously wrong. Because Christ has forgiven you. How many times? Matthew 18 again. How many times should I forgive my brother who sins against me? 7 times? No, 70 times 7, Jesus said. So many times. In fact, every time. That's it. Because you've been greatly forgiven. And it gives the parable of the unmerciful servant. And one's forgiven a great amount, and he won't even forgive someone a debt that's a small amount. Well, you see, that's a position. We've been forgiven so much by the Lord Jesus Christ. Do you not have it in your heart to forgive your brother? So one, you've got to say sorry, and the other person's got to forgive. And then you resolve it. It's not rocket science, is it? But it's not something that the world can understand. So we need, of course, to know the Bible. We need to understand the Bible and know those biblical principles and know how the human soul is, and as the Bible describes it. And we mustn't underestimate this other thing as well, which we have, that the world doesn't have. And that's prayer. You can bring God. And in fact, you must do. You meet in the sight of God. So there you are. You're seeking to be reconciled to your brother. You're in the sight of God. Now, that's got to temper your heart, hasn't it? And then, of course, you can pray to God. And that's important. Christian leaders, now here's the other thing. When I come down to Christian leadership and eldership, Christian leaders are counsellors. Now, again, you think maybe the pastor is the one who preaches from the pulpit. But he's also a counsellor. And he counsels not by worldly methods. He doesn't study Freud and all that mumbo-jumbo kind of counselling. That's worthless, right? But biblical counsel. And so he helps them. And so there's conflict resolution. It might be marriage guidance. You don't need a marriage guidance counsellor. Not in the church. Within the church, you resolve it. the pastor acts like a marriage counsellor. And sometimes, if a difficulty is quite difficult, I would say this, that it's other pastors might be at the consent of other people to say, look, we need to ask another pastor whether they might be willing to help. Because I feel this is a little bit beyond my experience. And so you do call upon maybe another church. And this is all done very sensitively, of course, and up front. But you can solve the problems. The church has the capacity to solve the problems within the church. What we shouldn't do is this: trust the world. What does the world know about marriage? What does the world know about two fellow believers walking by faith with Jesus Christ? Doesn't know. The first thing is completely hopeless. You can go and see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whatever. Waste of time, waste of money. Don't do it. It's like going to court, really. Come and see your pastor. And if he can't help you, he might involve someone else. In fact, it might. There's a great need, isn't there? Here, Paul says, look, he's quite firm about this. He says, I say this to your shame. Isn't there a wise man in the church? Isn't there someone who can help? And it might be, there's the great need, isn't it, what Paul is saying here, for Christian maturity. That might be a man, or it might be a husband and wife. Now again, that's a really good counselling team, isn't it? When you've got a husband and wife, and you've got someone of both genders, maybe the wife might be more sensitive to the woman and other such things. It's a good thing. It comes from experience, spiritual maturity, and that's why these things are so important. The church should have within it that maturity, that experience, that God-given ability to be able to resolve spiritual issues that are faced between two believers.